If you're a parent and you have kids, and you're looking for advice in the Bible, particular instruction from the Bible in terms of how to raise your child, look no further than the Gospel of Luke chapter 2. The story of the finding of the child Jesus in the temple, which is typically associated with the feast day of the Holy Family. So basically, as a matter of background, what you find in the context of this particular story is that the child Jesus is lost for a period of 3 days in the city of Jerusalem. But then Mary and Joseph finally discover him in the context of the Jerusalem temple, teaching and otherwise conversing with the elders. And obviously the key part of that particular story is this dialogue between the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Christ child. And so basically after Mary expresses her anxiety and dismay at having lost Jesus for 3 days, Jesus says something, but then he does something. And both are really important. So first of all, what he says is, "Did you not know I must be in my Father's house?" But then secondly, what he does is that he goes home with them. And so the gospel says that he goes home with them and he is obedient to Mary and Joseph, as a result of which he grows in wisdom and stature and in the opinion of God and his people. So if you put it all together, what the gospel is basically saying is that both parents and children have to be aware of two factors at play that are meant to be at play when it comes to their particular relationship. And so first of all, this notion that it is my primary duty to become the person that the Father is calling me to be. And no one can interfere with that. Not my parish priest, not my parents, not even apparently the Blessed Virgin Mary. So there's that. But at the same time, this notion of Jesus going home and being obedient to Mary and Joseph reveals to us that God has set things up in such a way that he has put people in our lives, especially our parents, who are meant to help us grow, to become those persons that we are called to be. And so yes, we're called to be unique. We're called to be our distinct selves. But at the same time, we got to recognize that it conduces to our benefit to be obedient, to have relationships of deference and humility, to help us grow, to help us change, again, to help us become the persons that the Father is calling us to be. Now, obviously, on the part of children, this is meant to imply a certain respect and even reverence for the parent-child relationship, to recognize that God has something really special to communicate to children through their parents. So there's that. But at the same time, obviously, the greater burden, in a certain sense, lies in the parents. And so, given all that, I want to give parents particular instruction or particular advice as to how to navigate the parent-child relationship in light of what we're hearing today in the context of the gospel. And so the first thing that comes to mind is to make sure that your love for your children is completely unselfish. And obviously, this could be kind of challenging at times, right? Because we're used to having relationships which are mutually beneficial or reciprocal in a certain sense. And it's not to say that parents don't benefit in some way by having children. Certainly that is the case, right? But at the same time, you want to make sure that your love for your children is purely a giving love as opposed to a taking love. And so in that regard, perhaps I might suggest that two things can be really helpful. First of all, to be rock solid in terms of your own identity and value in the eyes of the Lord, which is no small thing. Because too often, too easily, we tend to forget that God is always meant to have the primary place in our hearts. And whenever we forget that, we tend to make unreasonable demands on the people around us to fill that space in our hearts, which only the Lord alone should fill, whether we're talking about a relationship with a spouse, a friend, or even our children. The second thing that can be really helpful in this regard is to avoid a relationship of triangulation, which is basically to say this. It's really important for kids to be kids, as opposed to taking on adult problems, because, quite frankly, it's hard enough to be a kid and to learn how to become an adult. Never mind trying to become an adult prematurely. Because, of course, what often happens is that a particular parent might get in the habit of dumping their problems on a child, as opposed to sharing these things and working these things out with their spouse, which, again, can create all sorts of problems. A dysfunctional marriage, but also, again, more to the point, an unfair burden on this child. Whereas, again, what you're called to do is work things out with your spouse, to lean on each other, to give your children the freedom to simply be kids, and to trust that that's good enough. In any case, that brings us to the second overall thing I want to talk about. And this is this notion that parents need to recognize that always, they're meant to be the primary educators of their kids, as we hear in the Catechism at the Catholic Church. Now, obviously, this is not to say that other people, other structures in society are not meant to be helpful to parents in terms of raising their kids. And so, for example, there's a reason why we have aunts, uncles, grandparents, teachers, priests, youth ministry. At the same time, you got to recognize there's always something really unique and powerful about the parent-child relationship. And so, for example, when I speak to your kids, I might give them compelling reasons why they might do this as opposed to that. But again, there's something always really unique and powerful about recalling how my father said this or my mother said this, in terms of saying, look, this is right, this is wrong, this is true, and this is false. But you see, we can even take it one step further, right? And so you always need to remember as parents that the primary way in which you educate your kids is by what you actually believe as opposed to what you say. And so therefore, if there's any sort of tension or conflict or dispute between the words that you say to your kids and the witness that you give, the kids will always listen to your witness as opposed to your words. And so, for example, I can't tell you how often I talk to kids who are afraid not simply because of things like grades and a future career, but also because they are afraid of making a mistake. There's a lot of pressure on kids nowadays to have everything figured out from an early age and to not screw up, to not make a mistake. This idea that I live in a world which is unforgiving, a world without mercy, a world in which I can never recover from mistakes made in the past. And so therefore, again, I need to get it all right from the beginning and all rides on me. And I have to admit that for myself, whenever I talk to kids and this particular mentality comes through, either implicitly or explicitly, I often think to myself, where do they get this? And I gotta admit that a lot of times I think to myself that perhaps, possibly, if not probably, this mentality of fear and overt self-reliance and self-protection comes from one's parents. This idea that I pass on to my kids, not just knowledge, but also my fear, my sense of undue attachment. And so if you're a mom or a dad and you're constantly living in fear and tension and the sense that, again, it all depends on me, your kids will adopt that particular mentality, quite apart from what you say to them. Whereas in contrast, if you believe in God, like you really believe in God, in the sense that you believe in His providence, you believe in His merciful love, you believe that He can make all things new, and you have that sense of relaxation and peace that flows from that clarity, your kids will pick up on that too. Because again, they're paying attention to what you actually believe as opposed to what you actually say. But that brings us to our third and final point, which is basically to say this. Your kids, regardless of what you might perceive to be the case on the surface, are hungering and thirsting for God. And so even though the world and even your own experience might suggest to you that your kids have lost a sense of idealism, that they don't have any sense of deep desire, that they are simply cynical and bitter, that's simply not true. Because the reality is that the human heart, by virtue of being human, is always and truly restless until it rests in the Lord, to quote St. Augustine. And so to illustrate the point, I want to end with one kind of final example. And so basically a couple of weeks ago, while it was still the season of Advent, the parish youth minister and I visited a grade 7 class in one of our local elementary schools. Now it just so happens that this particular class visit went overtime, and so finally we were interrupted by the recess bell, at which point most of the class basically put on their boots and left for recess, except for this one girl. And so she wanted to talk to the youth minister and myself throughout recess, and we were obviously really happy to accommodate. But you see, here's the thing. Throughout the course of this short private conversation with this amazing, beautiful little girl, we covered all sorts of ground. And so basically, she would ask a question, we would give an answer. That would in turn provoke something in her heart, and then she had more questions to ask. And before long, she was experiencing this whole range of emotions, again, in a really short period of time. And so she was crying, she was laughing, she was smiling, asking more questions. We were giving her more answers, and this led to a deeper and deeper conversation. And then finally, recess was over, and she left smiling and feeling so much better than before. And obviously for myself, for the youth minister, I'm sure, we both felt amazing to have had the opportunity to have that type of conversation with that student, with that little girl. But at the same time, I gotta be honest, what I was thinking to myself throughout the whole time was, I think this girl really wants to talk to her parents. I mean, it's great that she felt that she could talk to us, but again, I really felt throughout the entire conversation that this is a conversation that she really wanted to have with her mom, with her dad, but for whatever reason, she didn't feel like she could have that conversation. And so maybe she didn't feel safe with her parents. Maybe she didn't feel like she could trust her parents with her wounded, complicated heart. Maybe she felt like they couldn't say anything to her which would actually help her. In any case, regardless of what the reason might be, that's a tragedy. And so, yeah, I'm really happy to fill in the gap when I can and when the opportunity arises. But my real hope, my real desire, my real prayer is that parents will be able to have these types of conversations with their kids. Not just once, but all the time, as a matter of course. Because, here's the thing. When it comes to this little girl, her beautiful heart is not an isolated case. All kids recognize on some level that their relationship with their parents is sacred ground. It's holy ground. It's a place where I am meant to grow in wisdom and stature, and in the opinion of God and His people, in imitation of Christ the Lord. And may God bless you all.